So experiment, a sort of topic which is, I mean, to what extent is experiment the very fabric of modernist project? Sharon, you start reading.
Invention, difference, resistance, investigation, intuition, research, deduction, projection, rupture, poesis, interruption, speculation, paradigm, striation. Are all the great modernist works of art experimental by definition? In turn, are they also transgressive as condition? Is experimentation the main means whereby the production of the new can occur? Are experiment and invention similar on the level of outcome?
Are there any thoughts about those questions before we begin? So those are my main questions. Are there other questions? Okay.
No question, but
Go on.
you're talking about how a work of art has come about, and I've just come across a very interesting experiment that somebody did, a magician, that I thought might be relevant to this, but we can chat about it later.
Okay.
Art can only claim provisional outcomes for itself, as opposed to conclusive results that is invariably the outcome of a scientific method. This implies a different model of experiment pertaining to these disciplines. Whereas science aspires to represent its findings as true, art presents a condition closer to the presentation of freedom.
So there's...
In a way, when you're conducting science experiments, surely it's almost like it's narrowing down to a finite point, isn't it? Where you're arriving at an outcome you're expecting or you're anticipating. Whereas I feel like an art experiment opens out the other way.
Yeah, it's positivism. Whereas experimenting art maybe opens out the opposite condition. Derrida. It's a long text, but it's worth thinking about the difference between invention and experiment. For Sharon.
In 1984, Derrida delivered 2 lectures at Cornell University, repeated at Harvard in 1986, called Psyche, Invention of the Other, in which he advanced a discussion about invention. His first major proposition is that an invention always presupposes some illegality. Straight away, this strikes in accord with the modern history of the work of art, but not with the idea of the academy. Derrida then goes on to discuss allegory as the invention of the other, and with this, the idea that invention cannot be inherently private because it always has public implication. Invention for Derrida implies originality and in turn a set of values associated with genius. In speaking of originality, the question of invention is the singular structure of an event that will produce the coming or the coming about of something new. Invention does not take place without an inaugural event, which is understood as the inauguration for a future of a possibility. The advent of the event of invention thus requires social consensus in order to create validity for the future, which is why invention is susceptible to repetition, exploitation, reinscription. In this passage, Derrida sets up an enigmatic play of advent and event, of future to come, adventure, and of convention within the framework of discussing invention. What is always central, though, is the coextensivity between invention and the arrival of the future. Derrida notes in this regard that the Oxford English Dictionary defines invention as the action of coming upon or finding. To be inventive implies the development of a reflexive structure, which is rather than coincidence or with presence to itself. There is a projection forward to the advent of the self.
So this is my first citation of an experiment where Brian Jellicoe was trying to work out how to depict or present Christ as Christ's torment in a multiplicity of ways. So it extends the relationship between temporality and the image.
In his fresco painting mid-15th century, the artist Fra Angelico worked out how to animate the mocking and torment of Christ. Instead of a static and singular image, there are a multiplicity of hand and other gestures in order to capture the temporal unfolding of the subject. This experiment in the relationship of duration and gesture did not surface again until much later in art history. Leonardo da Vinci is invariably posited as a practitioner who was able to cross over the worlds of art, science, and technology. Yet his spirit of experiment could also result in errancy. When he attempted to discover another technique of fresco painting, it resulted in failure. Therefore, to conduct an experiment is a risk undertaken to introduce the new as a possibility, but can also be the mark of a failure to achieve progression.
Notebook of Leonardo.
To evoke the name of Leonardo is to produce an image of cross-disciplinary practice. This is beyond the possibility of it occurring in any modern context because of the specialization and fragmentation of knowledge. Connected to the idea of cross-disciplinary practice with Leonardo is the idea of genius, which was described by Kant as the ability to form the rules for any activity. The employment of camera obscura started as early as the Renaissance, but it became more widespread in the 17th century with the production of more refined lenses and with the theorization of optics by thinkers such as René Descartes and Isaac Newton. René Descartes authored the most important Enlightenment text on the question of method, in which he deduced that method was truth, or that it was the process by which truth was established. Cartesian philosophy was predicated on the distinct separation of the subject and object, and method was the means of eliminating the vagaries of the subject from the research process.
That's opposite from fine art, really, where the vagaries of the subject are often very central to the process. This is Joseph Wright of Derby, an experiment on a bird in the experiment on a bird in the air pump. So either if the experiment succeeds, the bird lives. If the experiment fails, the bird dies. This was a moment of revelation when the uncertainty principle is cast aside and the bird lives.
Joseph Wright of Derby produced this work that became a symbol of progressive science. The painting itself signifies the sense of a moment. Will the white dove live or die? The lighting is not just the light of observing, but also carries with its illumination the revelation that science delivers. When Turner requested that he should be strapped to the mast in order to experience a storm, he closed the distance between the perceiving subject and the intended object. Therefore, Turner established a relationship between the subjective encounter and the perception of the object of attention, and therefore the actual painting expressed this fusion.
Picasso, with experiments in the relationship between 2 and 3 and 4 dimensions. And Cubism. Just one more and then we'll have someone else.
Sure. The turn of the 20th century witnessed the inauguration of ideas relating to the unconscious, relativity, and the fourth dimension, and the advent of cinema. With this came the sensations of discontinuity, fragmentation, and discharge or shock. This implied a principle of reality based on abstractions that defied totalizing vision based upon representations based on stable identity.
Wittgenstein. So who'd like to read? Jessica, you've got a good reading voice.
Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote the Tractus Logico Philosophicus in 1918. It was written as a series of over 500 declarative statements that contained barely any arguments. As such, it had an enigmatic quality consisting of a series of central propositions such as, "The world is everything, that is the case." James Joyce inaugurated a profound change in the context of the modernist novel. Ulysses 1922 was based upon the structure of Homer's Odyssey and was in turn an experiment in a stream of consciousness and with this wordplay.
This is a green box and Duchamp's Bride stripped bare by a bachelor's eve and a large glass exhibited in 1926.
Marcel Duchamp is a curious case as an artist who stretched the boundaries of the established paradigms, but also did this partly through arcane means and references. This implied a systematic approach to his productions, but also served as a disguise for more subjective arenas of engagement.
Filmmaker Eisenstein.
The invention of cinema required not just the development of technology, but a language of the moving image, and with this, an approach to the editing process. To this end, Sergei Eisenstein developed his theory of montage, and with this, the idea of the third sense.
This shows the implications of lining up the relationship between image, sound, music, and structure.
Montage served to deliver the sensations of immediacy and simultaneity. This was both a product of technological transformation and a perceptual revolution, and this aligned aesthetic syntax with the release of technological forces.
This is a still from Bertolt's Man with the Movie Camera, who had a different relationship to montage.
The idea of the avant-garde was not only to be ahead of the game, but to open out culture to the experiment of producing the new. The artwork becomes its own object through containing a speculative dimension of what art might become. This relates to what Adorno referred to as a utopian blink.
The self-portrait by El Lissitzky, Russian supremacist and designer.
El Lissitzky worked across many different mediums and fields that included graphic and book design, posters architecture, exhibition presentation, sculpture, and photography. There was an underlying abstraction to all these vectors, namely that the visual and the technology formed a unified expression of a new social order.
Poster for the Bauhaus.
The Bauhaus came out of a vision of integration of all the arts, a research and experimental model, supplied a unifying principle that served to link artists and designers into a common direction. It was clearly predicated upon the notion that integrated design would aid the process of generating a rational society.
Paul Klee, experiment in colour. One more, and then we'll have another reader.
Paul Klee worked in the Bauhaus, producing a series of experiments related to colour and drawing processes, which were recorded in a series of notebooks. These in turn had a profound influence on the way that the underlying principles of art were taught in subsequent years.
Who's a new reader? Would like to go? Quickly. Return to Sharon then.
The playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht developed radical approaches to theatre that included the use of montage, interruption or stoppages, defamiliarization techniques, use of signs and music, staging linked to technological effects, employment of a narrator. This combined didacticism with experimental techniques which defined what was termed epic theatre.
Also engaged in epic is collaborating with Bertolt Brecht was the designer Aaron Piscator, played a very important role in this definition of epic theatre. This is Man Ray's self-portrait with a camera.
Man Ray conducted a whole series of darkroom experiments by testing the limits of chemical and light exposures. In effect, he was breaking all the rules pertaining to existing techniques. As opposed to having a theory of possible effects, there was instead a complete open encounter to the realm of the unknown. But it was this play of the unconscious possibilities of photography that was so distinctive. Alexandra, how do you say his name? Kojève delivered lectures on the subject of Hegel in Paris between 33 to 39. He attracted a whole array of intellectuals keen to listen to his programmatic commentary. His audience included Georges Bataille, André Breton, Jacques Lacan, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Michel Léry, and Raymond Aron, amongst others. The debates around this reading had a profound impact on this generation.
So one of the features of experiments is often they produce a network or a confluence of thinkers and practitioners. This is still from Balinese theatre.
Antonin Artaud wrote The Theatre and Its Double in 1938 as a series of essays as a corrective to a form of theatre that had become over-dependent on written and spoken language. Instead, he called for the recovery of a unique language halfway between gesture and thought. And with this a form of theatre of cruelty or violent rigor. Balinese dance theatre exemplified this new approach for him. This model had a profound effect on a wide range of art forms, such as Japanese Buto dance, performance art, Peter Brook's productions, the living theatre, and the films of Pasolini.
This is the architect Buckminster Fuller, who was famous for his geodesic domes, particularly his focus on the Black Mountain College.
Black Mountain College was an experimental college that was formed in 1933 and closed in 1957. The list of artists and designers who passed through is remarkable, but included Charles Olson, John Cage, Joseph and Annie Albers, Buckminster Fuller, Merce Cunningham, Cy Twombly, Robert Motherwell, Walter Gropius, Robert Rauschenberg, and Franz Klein. My God, what a list.
Yeah, fantastic. One of the most important projects in history of modernity. Just a little bit, not quite as important as Bauhaus, but quite significant in its implication. This is a painting by Joseph Albers, who kept to the same format of color relationships, geometrical color relationships for 25 years. So his experiment was long in its duration.
His painting Homage to the Square Apparition, 1959, is a part of a series that occupied him for 25 years. The repeated format of these paintings enabled him to concentrate all of his attention to the question arising out of the perception of color. On the back of each canvas, Albers included technical details and codification of the making of each painting in order to eliminate any transcendental elements from the painting.
This is Merce Cunningham, the dancer and choreographer, who experimented a lot with technology both in his rehearsal and his actual performances.
Merce Cunningham explored the way in which the body moved in unusual positions rather than basing his choreography on a more formal level. In order to better understand this process, he utilized film and video to try to study this at a once removed.
This is his collaboration with Jasper Johns, who kind of made a staging of the large glass in another format. But he worked collaboratively with Jasper Johns, John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, amongst others.
Whereas Cunningham, John Cage, and Robert Rauschenberg experimented with new ways of combining the various practices in order to create new modes of synthesis. This resulted in a discovery of innovations in syntax and form with performance that enabled all participants to be part of the experiment of coming into presence.
The work by Robert Rauschenberg, which used light sensors and heat sensors as part of its fabric. So it actually explicitly experimented in new forms of technology and visualities, visual presentations, drawn from industrial and commercial sectors.
Robert Rauschenberg was fascinated by the possibilities offered by investigating technology, but this was always placed in relationship to his powers of intuition. He experimented with sound-sensitive installations and light-responsive ambient soundworks. As a co-founder in Experiments in Art and Technology, EAT, he opened out the possibilities of the relationship of the respective fields.
It's an early photograph of Miles Davis.
Miles Davis was one of the greatest performing artists of the second half of the 20th century. He was responsible for changing the direction of jazz several times, changes that included hard bop, the cool, fusion, electro, jazz, and funk. His restless impulse led him to work with many significant musicians and to experiment constantly.
So in an interview with John McLaughlin, he recounts how Miles Davis said to him once, "When I get musicians together, I pay them to experiment. I don't want to repeat anything. I just want them to, I pay them to experiment. I want to hear the unknown, not the known." This is a composer, German composer, Karlheinz Stockhausen.
Karlheinz Stockhausen was a central figure in the evolution of the electronic music. He introduced controlled chants into serial compositions.
This is a composer, Lamont Young.
Lamont Young studied with John Cage, and in 1960 he produced written works in the form of instructions called compositions.
This is just a single note to be held for a long time. It's composition number 7. So he was one of the first conceptualists in a way. This is the Beatles in the mid-60s, late mid-60s, who started to use, they gave up performing live because it was too crude, and took up the use of the studio as a kind of additional instrument, or a sort of mega instrument.
The Beatles withdrew from live performances in the mid-60s and instead embarked on sustained recording sessions in which the studio itself became not only an additional instrument, but a site for experiment. These included manipulation of tape loops, electronic effects, and the employment of instruments such as the sitar.
It's a photograph of a dub performance.
Dub is a style of music that grew out of the reggae in the late 60s and early 70s. It's based upon a process of re-engineering existing recordings and manipulating these with the use of echo and splicing in additional elements by overlaying processes. When performed live, this overlaying is called toasting.
There's still from Le Jeté by Chris Marker. One more, Sharon.
La Jetée 1962 is a science fiction film by Chris Marker that consists entirely of still images, with the exception of one tiny fragment in which movement occurs. The film itself is a formal experiment which is set in a post-nuclear setting. The film stages an experiment in time travel and examines the question of memory within this.
Someone else. Fabiano.
I can read.
Okay.
Okay.
Starting in the late 60s, Warhol produced a large series of what he termed screen tests, but these works were never presented as being art within Warhol's lifetime. They might be understood as an example of bad infinity because it had no framing related to completion. When Shigeto Kabuto, 1965, performed a painting with a paintbrush attached to her vagina, it was not clear if this action was an experiment or simply a transgressive action based on a predominantly masculine relationship to gestural painting. Eve Hess, in her work Repetition 19111, 1968, explored the realm of material embodiment of sculptural language that contained a sensitivity, that contained a touch-feel quality, as opposed to the indifference of a more industrial-like production. Her studio was given over to experiments related both to forming, but also deforming matter, within gestures of sitting, leaning, and hanging.
This is a still from the assembly of an exhibition in 1969, which was called When Attitudes Become Form in the ICA. And the creator just handed over the responsibility for hanging to the artist. The artist had to sort it out, which was both a fractious process, but also led to a new form of hanging, which was very different from predominantly formalist exhibitions.
The exhibition, When Attitudes Become Form, was groundbreaking in terms of the organization of the space, which was largely left to all the artists to determine. The appearance of the works on display appeared to be chaotic, but this experiment in curation became the hallmark of exhibiting such works which opposed the previous generation of formalist art.
This is one work by the artist Victor Bergen.
Victor Bergen's work, Photopath, 1967-69, breaks the rule of photography by staging the closure of the gap between the real and the photographic representation of it. The work itself breaks free of the bounded condition of photography.
So it's just a written instruction translated into a physical form, but the work itself was an instruction. You bought the instruction, not the work. This is Joseph Kosuth's One and Three Chairs.
The idea of investigation was to surface with practices associated with analytical conceptual art, mostly associated with the work of Joseph Kosuth, who was influenced by Wittgenstein's logical positivism.
Positivism.
Kosuth proposed that art itself was a form of analytical proposition that utilized the idea of tautologies as a central device. Conceptualism could also be read as a mode of iconoclasm, and that not only repudiated painting as inherently regression, but pursued the gesture of the least condition of art, or even the notion of the final piece of art as the logic of its reductive strategies. Part of the rhetoric of investigation, or even sets, was to be seen in the serial attitude embodied by much of this movement, in contrast with the more process-orientated practices of art povera and aspects of minimalism. Likewise, the rhetoric of performance art of the period involved concepts to do with demonstration or experiment.
Painting in Uglo.
Sorry, I'm just writing that down. The painting in Uglo painted the human figure by employing a plumb line to exactly measure one element against the next, until the whole body and the whole figure corresponded to complete measure. In turn, he limited his palette to 13 or 14 colours plus white. This example of the closest to a method in the art of measurability, but at the same time, something escapes this into an unnameable surplus. Robert Morris produced a series of drawings called Blind Time that were started in 1973. Each of the drawings followed an instruction, but were always executed with the eyes closed. The experiment appeared to close a gap between performance and the object, but also between gestural and minimal systems of working in the way to process was revealed.
So the philosopher Gaston Bachelard.
The idea of an epistemological break or rupture was introduced by Gaston Bachelard in order to explain how obstacles within scientific understanding are overcome. This idea was developed in turn by Louis Althusser to explain the development in Marx's thinking in order to articulate the difference between two opposing approaches to the exposition of knowledge.
His main book, Reading Capital.
Reading Capital was published in 1968 and was a project that was based upon the notion that Marx's writing could be separated into the early humanist passage and the later scientific period. This process was viewed as theoretical practice, which in turn introduced the notion of a deep reading of texts in order to reveal their structural orientation.
It's very much part of structuralism was to reveal the deeper structures. The Canal-Thusser amongst the structuralists, who all were concerned with deep structure and deep reading of texts. This is Deleuze and Guattari.
When Deleuze and Guattari wrote the two volumes of The Capitalism and the Schizophrenia, it was understood as a project relating to discovering a language that would correspond to a post-political reality. In effect, they were breaking the rules of what constituted the boundaries of philosophy. This project had a profound influence on the art world.
Amongst one of the aims of writing was to write closer to, let's say, James Joyce rather than to structuralist writing. So a kind of fusion between poetry and poetic and the philosophic and the kind of wordplay. So they introduced a lot of hybrid words like bodies without organs taken from poets like Antonin Artaud, desiring machines, the subjectile. So it's an invention of language as much as a project of exposition of philosophical ideas. This is a page from a book by Derrida called Glass. One more, then we'll get someone else to read.
Jacques Derrida wrote Glass, 1974, in a format that was influenced by the remaining fragment of a book written by Jean Genet on Rembrandt. The book consists of two main columns in which citations were woven into them. It's closer to a method derived from the principles of collage. Derrida described the text as a sort of wake in an explicit reference to Joyce and his work, Finnegan's Wake.
Which is the most obscure novel of the 20th century. This is still from the exhibitions by Francois Lyotard. Who would like to read?
I can go. The exhibition Les Matériaux from 1985 was curated by Jean-François Lyotard and Thierry Chapot at the Pompidou Center as an anticipation of the changing condition of art in the age of globalism, presenting a new way of recording change within art itself and a process of generating a series of questions, intersections. The exhibition sought a new way of staging ideas and practice. Shumei Tomatsu, untitled. Traces, fades, crops, dazzles, scans, out of focus visuality, unusual perspectives, discentered views, blurs, infinities, displacements, suspensions, separations, intensification of visibilities. All these floating figures of the photographic, mutating and recording into indefinite combinations that draw from forms outside of themselves. Shumei Tomatsu extended the syntax of photography in ways that experimented with errancy as much as clarity. He took photography to a condition that was outside of its former condition.
The Seascape series by Hiroshi Sugimoto. Just read the top.
Okay. Hiroshi Sugimoto produced his Seascape series from 1908 onwards. Each image results from a meticulous technical process, so it's a series of experiments in the actual apparatus of photography. What are so very commonplace are these substances, they hardly attract attention, and yet they push our...
Leave that.
Okay.
This is Andres Serrano.
Andres Serrano, 1996, produced his work by shooting his semen in front of his camera. He had to experiment with the relationship between the shutter speed and the velocity of the ejaculation, so it was highly technical undertaking. The work was called Portfolio, Body and Soul. In his sculptural presentation entitled 1999-2002, Tom Friedman, a chair is balancing a state between the condition of being and not being. If there is an experiment, then it relates to discovering that midpoint of this state. It is an exposition of a process more than a conclusive point of realization.
So there's the...
In this untitled 2009 work by Sarah Zip, there is an inventive installation of a portable planetarium. Invention implies originality, and for Derrida, it cannot take place without an inaugural event. In this, it is linked to coming of the coming about of something new. With this work by Doris Salcedo, Plegaria Muda, 2008-2010, grass is seen grown through the tables. It was produced after spending time in Los Angeles with women who had lost their children to gang wars. The impulse of this work began with a process of being with those who have suffered loss, and thus the work becomes a symbolic testimony to this sense of loss.
This is the film collage right at the door.
Christian Marclay presented his video montage of his work Doors 2022 as a joining together of film footage of entrances and exits through doors. This cutting together of diverse film passages sets up a repetitious compulsive movement based on what are generally linking passages within the narrative. In this way, what is background becomes foreground.
I'll see you later. Sorry.
Going through the door.
Go
on. So, Christian Mark. Experiment 1V by Kate Bush. When we were working secretly for the military, our experiment in sound was nearly ready to begin. We only knew in theory what we were doing: music made for pleasure, music made to thrill. It was music we were making here until they told us all they wanted. It was a sound that could kill someone from a distance. So we go ahead and the meters are over in the head red. It's a mistake in the making. From the painful cries of mothers to a terrifying scream. We recorded it and put it to a machine. There is invariably a value ascribed to the experimental process, and that is one related to progression. Within modernity, there was an inscription of a sense of progress, which was a form of value in it for itself. Within a contemporary passage, this sense has been diminished by something closer to novelty, and with this, a decline of the resistance to the present.
So that's the presentation. So any thoughts? I'm aware of, we rushed through it a little bit because we don't want to leave time for the presentation of the work. But we've got 15 minutes to discuss.
Yeah,
You start the presentation, sorry, with modernity, but have artists not always wanted to chase down the new, to challenge the status quo, to think about things in different ways?
Yeah, but I was mainly focused on modernity. It just become too big of an undertaking. I mean, you've got technical experimentation, the evolution of mediums, overlaid with optical insights and the nature of subjectivity, and so dozens of experiments overlaid and folded into each other. So the question is invariably art within modernity a form of experimentation, or is experimentation quite a rare phenomenon within the development of art? Is it mainly the repetition of the self-same? So experiment is some sort of intervention into the event of repetition and habit. So experimentation, nature experiments, but it's very rare that you get a change in the syntax within nature. Often it leads to this habit leads to extinction. Very often that lack of adaptation. So experimental model could be seen as the incline of nature towards having to experiment. And then you've got the whole question of the difference between scientific method and aesthetic evolution. There's very different outcomes. I mean, when you made your work this summer, what was your experiment?
You're talking about my work. My experiment was to go into a space and see what would come in, what would come into the space. So just to arrive with very little and see what would come from it, the energetics that would come from it.
So what were the component features? What were the component materials?
A bag of clay and a wall, and time. So time and space, no interruptions, privacy. And
so
yeah.
You set conditions.
Yeah, I did.
Non-interruption. What else did you set up? What was the condition for yourself?
A freedom to allow just to see what would come. So no expectations I say that, but then once I'd done one.
Was that quite rare in your practice?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what was the sense of the experiment that you were conducting? What was the sense of what would an experiment likely to deliver? Or was it the unknown?
It was a stepping into the unknown, I think. And then it was a process of stepping in and out of the unknown to see what was coming and try to work with controlling it. But then, yeah, just finding that space to fly, really.
So how much did you think through the experiment in advance, or was it also intuitive and spontaneous?
Totally intuitive and spontaneous, and that's ultimately how I like to do everything. It's about creating that space and those boundaries, and then allowing that time to then just to see what comes. And I realize I do that more and more with lots of different areas of my life. So
that's opened you up.
Definitely, yeah. I think if we're not experimenting, we're not feeling alive. We're not feeling alive inside our practice. I think we're not reinventing or reimagining or pushing or driving anything forward.
So it's essentially ontological, question of being rather than a question of knowing.
Definitely.
Has anyone else got?
Or maybe question of coming, evolving. I was thinking about the nature evolve, say survival of the fittest, sort of in certain direction, perhaps. For human activities like literally movement, like James Joyce, or art movement, like contemporary art, going against the representation and all that, in a way, is quite a reaction and more of dialectic. We have one way and something against it, and then something another against it. So what I'm trying to say is the natural way of progressing has its own way, and humans' way of experimenting, inventing is let's see what happens. What if we do something totally opposite? There's intention behind it. Sometimes we go against nature, sort of thing.
So
I think there are sort of differences between that. Yeah.
So one of the greatest experiments in the 20th century was to do with atomic fusion, which generated both control and fear as a condition, universal fear. You can say that COVID was an outcome of an experiment. If one side of the story is to be believed. Any other examples from within practice of experimentation? Any insight into experiment?
One thing that I think is good to parallel is between experimentation and editing, because some of the examples you've presented, there's perhaps a lot of experimentation and something is selected, a particular moment that is going to be presented. In other situations, the experimentation doesn't need to be successful, but it will be presented in any way. I think in music, in theater, these are more common, whereas in cinema, you have, if you experimenting with editing, usually you select something. Oh, this works, and so this goes into the film. So I think it's nice to see which artist adds the experimentation and which doesn't.
Often in the 60s, in art schools, they had an experimental unit, and if you were in an experimental unit, you didn't have to have outcomes. you had an open-ended, see what happens. You didn't know whether it was going to result in an artifact or not.
I guess that's the right way of doing it, because if you're expecting an outcome, then it won't be an experiment.
But there's the situation of positivism whereby you anticipate the result, you do the experiment to ensure the methodological security of the experiment as much as decided upon a fixed outcome.
I think also because I have the sort of theoretical side of my practice, which I'm trying to build, and the making side comes more naturally to me. And it's through experimenting between the two. That's the way I work. But it's far more instinctive to actually make something. I have an idea, and then actually find out, yes, this actually does link back to the theoretical side of what I'm trying to create. I find at the moment that's the way I kind of work, but it is through experimenting, definitely.
That's where I guess science and art sort of overlap a bit, because an experiment is a very scientific thing, because we're talking about fixing conditions and repeating conditions.
I mean, method is to secure the repetition of the self-same in science. I mean, Descartes claimed that method was truth. So it had to, truth had to be secured through method. Whereas it's doubtful whether art is ever a presentation of the truth.
Yeah, but then you also get, different kinds of experimentation, don't you? That I think we sort of picked up a little bit on this earlier, that that in some cases, that experimentation is to undermine method, which is to say it's to undermine the the will and the choice of the artist by introducing randomness or chance or juxtaposing things without predetermining them. So it can also be the enemy of method as well.
Mm. Yeah, so we could have a model of experiment which goes in both directions, one towards method and one towards destroying method.
And the same thing, you sort of some people linking the ideas of sort of experimentation, a discovery of new ways of doing things to genius. But again, when experimentation points the other way, it's intended to, subjugate that idea of genius by taking decision-making out of the hands of the artist, and saying that, that randomness will produce something worthier than predetermined thought will. So yeah, it applies there as well.
I was thinking that's maybe one way where a scientific experiment is different to art experiment, because if one is carrying out a scientific experiment, you would have a theory. You would say, I'm going to do this because I expect to get that. Usually in science, you don't just randomly add things and subtract. I mean, they do, but but they'll say, well, my theory is based on these cells acting this way and these hormones acting that way. I'm going to add them and see. This is what I'm hoping to get at. But in art, I'm guessing, like Sharon said, that we just go in and add things and see what happens. You don't expect anything necessarily.
But in Sharon's case, there was definitely a look, which is secured through intimate relationship with other syntaxes. I mean, it was something which was regulative as well, something which kept the experiment in order. It didn't become disordered.
Can you have an experiment in art without any conditions, almost sort of like play, so you don't give yourself any condition or any boundary? Does that? I mean, that would, for me, that would feel like the freedom.
That's occurred, but it often results in chaos.
Is that? I mean, is that something worth? Is that the ultimate thing? It does result in chaos. It can't work. You can't find the new that way.
Well, the conditions is too open,
right?
Too infinite. So it's an opening out to bad infinity. I mean, you've got the example of Warhol when he did the screen tests. His condition was just to film. He used the Bolex camera, which had 100 feet, which is 3.1 something minutes of film. And he just sat the subject in front of the camera and asked them to sit there for 13 seconds. And he just filmed the outcome, put it in the can. He often didn't develop the film at all. But he didn't know. It was just a ritual practice when someone famous came to the studio, like Susan Sontag or Bob Dylan or whoever. He'd sit them down and film them. And they always found the 3 minutes to be exceptionally a long time to sit in front of a camera. They were undone by it very often. So the only control on it was that you sit there for 3 minutes, 13 seconds or 30 seconds, whatever it is. And a lot of the film wasn't developed until after his death. And then it was assembled as an artifact to the whole room of these films. Because when he started, there wasn't video technology. It was just a handheld Bolex camera, which only had 3 minutes worth of film in it, and they had to load it again. So it was an open experiment, repeated. And subjects behave differently according to their own predisposition for being looked at, or the self-consciousness of being looked at. Three minutes is a long time to be filmed, just say nothing.
So in a way, we need some sort of parameter that overlays these experiments or this crazy chaos, whatever space that we're working inside, to then, is it to give us some sort of handle as a human and give us some relationship to it or some way of dealing with it?
It's some sort of representational structure. So Warhol's case is 100 feet of film, and the instruction to the person being filmed was not to speak or anything, just to be a visual object of attention.
What is the definition of an experiment? Or was everything we do could be an experiment? Is it that we intend to do something and see what the result will be? Is that fair enough?
We don't know the end result.
Yeah.
Whereas if we're habitual, we always know, like if you do live painting, you know that you're going to just observe the model and make notations. There might be differences within it, but you know that what it's going to look like. You know that it's going to result in the naming. This is a live painting. It's a repetition of the self-same. So it's the tradition. So in a way, experiment breaks with habitual and traditional means of repetition.
I'd like to add that the experiment also links to discovery, because there is very little expectations when we do experiment. We don't know what's going to come, and then, oh, voila, this is what happened.
One more contribution, and we'll go on to the presentation of a practice.
I was just going to say that it does feels like something of an expectation now that, you know, if God forbid that you do something the same as what somebody else has done, you know, and which is, of course, ridiculous because we're all doing variations on what each other have done like tens of thousands of years anyway. And there is a limited range of subjects and objects and ways of representing things to investigate.
There's resistance to the possibility that is the case, but that's the condition.
Yeah. But it's, you know, but I do feel that there's an expectation that if you present something where there isn't any invention or experimentation, you know, it almost like gets kicked out of the category of fine art, you know, and so yeah, I think that would be my last comment, I would say.
And yet we don't really discuss what experiment is and what the history of experiment is, and we don't really take that as a topic of investigation, or we just assume it as a given.
Yeah. It reminds me of my scientist friend. They told me that if you want to be famous in science field is that you need to create a new word, like a wording. So you put this and this together and create a new wording and you will be famous.
Like the term epistemological break, when it was first inaugurated in structuralism by Gaston Bachelard and taken up by Louis Althusser in the study of Marx, it was parallel to the idea of paradigm shift. It was a kind of major buzzword or buzz phrase. So paradigm shift, and we don't seem to use paradigm shift now as a term, or epistemological break as a term, but these were all the buzzwords of the late 60s, early 70s. And the idea of a text having both a surface structure and a depth structure that was revealed through deep reading of a text was a buzz phrase, and the idea of theoretical practice was a buzz phrase. I remember meetings in Royal College in the 70s about theoretical practice in the film school. Anyway, more to be thinking about. So I'll hand over